name's Dan Munk. I'm the Irrigation, Soils, and Cotton Farm Advisor for UC Cooperative Extension here in Fresno County. And today we're in the Westside Research and Extension Center in 5 Points, California, just about 60 miles southwest of Fresno.
Okay, then go ahead. Talk about plant mapping.
So today I'd like to just give you a brief introduction to plant mapping and why it's important in cotton production systems. Just real briefly though, I'd like to talk a little bit about the production system. So the field behind me here was planted to both Pima and Acala type cottons. Each of those are very different species, have different production potentials, and basically are irrigated and fertility, pest management issues are somewhat unique between these two varieties. So today we're going to talk a little bit about planting dates, we're going to talk a little bit about harvest dates, and how these two different types, Gossypium hirsutum, which is the Acala type, and Gossypium barbadense, which is the Pima type cottons, how they're different in terms of their maturity, and why it is that plant mapping, or what kind of tool plant monitoring, plant mapping can be for this type of application. The field behind me today was planted about April 15th, and that's a pretty typical planting date here in the southern San Joaquin Valley. If we plant much earlier, we're probably not going to get added maturity because the temperatures are too cool. If we plant much later, the problem is we don't have enough heat units to actually finish the crop. The other issue there is that as we delay the time of first flower, in other words, we'd like to have that flower early in the season, we get flowering occurring during the very hot period of the summer months, and then what happens is we can have pollen issues with sterile pollen, heat stress on the plant, water stress. So the earlier we can go into flower, the better off this crop is. Now, so right behind me here, if we can pan over to the right, my right side, your left side, we'll see a field or a planted area of Acala cotton. A couple of things I want to point out with the cotton here, this Acala type, is that it's, first of all, the bolls are much larger than the Pima types. You'll see that the color of the fiber is bright white. Okay. The other element here that you'll see is these plants tend to be a little bit taller. They tend to have actually more what we call a columnar structure, but they also tend to be more determinate in their production and how we produce bolls on these plants. Now, if we pan over here to my left here, you'll see a slightly different looking plant. You'll see, first of all, there's more of a creamy color and a much smaller boll. You'll see that the plants tend to be a little bit shorter, but we will demonstrate, I'll try to demonstrate here shortly, where we actually need more different sites on the plant to actually make up yield. So I went ahead and I pulled a couple of plants, and I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about plant development and structures here, and talk a little bit about how this plant, which is very, very close, very soon, here we're in mid-September, by this time next month this crop will be harvested. So as you can see, most of these cotton bolls are opened. So let's talk about plant mapping and plant monitoring. Mapping is basically, it gives us a few ideas in terms of the productivity of the plant, the timing of boll formation, the timing of boll completion, and at this time of year we can actually identify when did this crop actually make the bulk of its production that we're going to see in that harvesting basket. So, as you can imagine, early on in the season after planting, we had a couple of cotyledon nodes that are opposing each other. Down on the bottom, that's sort of day one, or the 0 point of our plant mapping. And then from there, we see alternating nodes, what we call nodes, which are locations for potential branching, both fruiting and vegetative branches, to occur on alternated nodes going up the plant. So this would be, for instance, node 1. Now the leaf is gone, the branch is gone. It's basically fallen off during the season. However, At node 2, you can see that we still have a stem, and there was a potential for this to actually become what we call a vegetative branch. And these tend to be found lower on the plant. They actually do not have first position or early position fruit capacity there. But what we can have, and we see this on 2 nodes above, we see a vegetative branch here where we actually do have some production. Now these bolls here were produced very late in the cotton season this year. The other thing that we're going to notice with this particular plant in this particular field, I really just pulled this out for no particular reason, but it is representative of what's happened in the field this year. I want you to notice that there are very few bolls on this lower portion of the plant. Okay? So, the other thing I want you to notice is that we did not have first position fruit on this plant until much later, or first position potential. And what I mean by first position is that as we go up from the main stem, the first node that is encountered there, if there's a fruiting position on that site, then that's our earliest fruit that can be potentially harvested. There's a couple of things that can happen, but primarily these are pest management related issues. And the big problem that we have in cotton, particularly early season and with regard to fruit retention, is Lygus hesperus. It's a plant bug that basically goes in and takes out, inserts its mouth parts into the young developing square, keeps that square from turning into a flower, and that flower into boll by basically damaging that square early in its infancy. So what we see here early on in this particular plant is that Lygus is taken out an early part of the plant. We don't see production down here because our Lygus frequency, they invaded this field early on, and then later we gained some control measures. We actually went in and had a pesticide application that targets specifically this particular pest. And so we didn't get fruit formation, viable fruit formation, until the pest pressure subsided, and then we had very successful crop come from it. So that's the other thing. So as we count up nodes and as we evaluate where the fruit is on this plant, notice that approximately we have about maybe a total of about 12, 14, almost 15 fruit bolls here that are going to make and produce. The other thing that I want to point out is as we get to the later part of the season, when these upper bolls are produced, we actually run out of time. So while we have a square here, while we have another couple of squares up on top here, these did not go into flower early enough to have the heat units to mature and to basically turn into a productive part of the plant. So it's generally thought of by the time we get to this late August period when these young flowers are being produced. As we get into late August, we pretty much run out of time, in other words heat units, to actually see the developing flower as it goes and moves into a productive bulb. So those are a few things I want to point out with this Acala type plant. Now, I'll put this down for a moment and we can take a look at the Pima plant. And this should look a little bit different to you. A couple of things I want to point out. First of all, we've got a very some definite fruiting branches, what we call vegetative branches on the lower part of the plant, very prominent. And these Pima plants tend to be more indeterminate. That means they basically continue to fruit longer and longer into the season before basically carbohydrate reserves completely fill and move towards boll formation. So one of the reasons for that is that these bolls are much smaller, so there's a much smaller carbohydrate demand. Really, that carbohydrate demand is related to the seed that's actually in these bolls. A lot of that carbohydrate goes in and to basically form some of the oils and some of the more complex compounds that you find in the cotton boll and in the cotton seed in particular. So I want you to notice a few things. First of all, we still have a lot of missing positions down on this plant as well. Lygus hesperus likes those young developing Pima squares just as it likes those young developing Acala type squares. Okay, and so we've got a lot of crop missing from below. We do happen to have some fruiting positions happening on early branches here. So if I were to count up from our cotyledon nodes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on fruiting branch number 8, we actually have a first position fruit. So this is the piece of fruit here that went into flower first, and in this field it probably went into flower about July 1st, based on our planting dates, based on the type of heat units that we have had this year in 2017. We also have subsequent fruit on this branch, on this first fruiting branch, and we have a second, not only a first position piece of fruit here that matured, we have a second and a third position fruit that was squared also. Now, on the Acala types that we talked about earlier, roughly 70% or so of the yield can come from only these first position fruits. So and the reason why we know that is because we've gone through and we've conducted plant mapping and identified where those fruits are on the plant, both in terms of fruiting branches and in terms of position on the plant. So in terms of a progression, one of the things that we've learned also through plant monitoring is, one, that it takes about 3 days, a little over 3 days, to move from fruiting position site 1 on fruiting branch 1 to fruiting position 1 on fruiting branch 2. Okay? So basically what I'm saying is there's about a 3-day period between the flower here and the flower on the next fruiting branch. Another sort of rule of thumb that we can say is it's about 6 days as we go out on the branch, and in these second positions they're about 6 days apart. So while there are first position fruit up above, usually about 2 branches down we'll actually get some additional fruit being placed on the outside, or those progressive positions on the branch. The other thing that you should notice right away is look at the number of bolls here, right? So we've got a lot of open bolls, we've got a lot of closed bolls, much smaller boll, and so it requires about 3 to 1 in terms of the boll size to make the equivalent yield. So in Acala cotton types, about 110, 130,000 bolls per bale. And on these Pima types, we're looking at maybe 260 to about close to 300,000 bolls per bale, based on the variety and the conditions for their growth. The other thing that you'll notice is as we move up the plant, we look at multiple positions on the branch, you'll see, again, as we noted below, a lot of different positions here. So we've got an axial position. So we've got a boll here being produced down on the main stem. That happened after this boll was actually produced on the first position. We also have a second, third, and fourth position fruit here. Much more productive, but remember these are much smaller bolls. So we actually, to make equivalent yield, we need to be evaluating what's happening on a numbers basis here. So, what are some of the issues that happen with Pima relative to Acala? As you might imagine, even though we go into first flower about the same time for each of those varieties, we actually need more time to actually build this plant and so that we can try to obtain equivalent yields. Do we get equivalent yields in the San Joaquin Valley? Not necessarily. Typically, Pima yields in good cotton ground throughout the San Joaquin Valley, we're going to get about 90% of the Acala yield in the same location. In other areas, in some years, we can get equivalent, and in some cases, we can even get a slightly higher yield in Pima than we do in Acala. But more often than not, we're going to actually see slightly lower yields for Pima cotton. As we go south into Kern County, as we go to the east side of the San Joaquin Valley in light soil types, the Acala types tend to perform a little bit better. You might have a 20 or 30% differential in yield, and that's where you actually see we still continue to farm some of on lighter soils. We tend to continue to farm some of our Acala types. So why this business and why this concern about Pima and Acala cotton? and their differences, well, their production systems are different, but I also want to point out a couple of things. Much longer and stronger fiber from these smaller bolls. Okay, Pima cotton is a premium cotton. You can often get 50% more or more, sometimes 60, 70% more on the market on a per pound of lint basis. So we continued to grow Pima. It really was introduced in the 1980s, and then really we only had legal production, open production systems in the valley in early 1990s. 1991 was the first time that we legislated the actual widespread growth and incorporation of Pima cotton types into the San Joaquin Valley Quality Cotton Program. Maybe the last couple of things I'll bring up. So these Pimas tend to be about 7 to 10 days in additional maturity. So they're going to be some of the first cotton to be planted in the San Joaquin Valley and some of the last to be harvested. We want every heat unit to be here. We're in mid September right now. In the next week or so, we're going to be defoliating. And I artificially defoliated this by just pulling the leaves off so I can demonstrate what this plant actually looks like in terms of fruiting positions and productivity. So with that, big significant changes in these two plants. One is going to be earlier maturity. One, you're only going to see maybe 10 or 15 bolls on an individual plant, depending upon plant spacing. Another, we might see 30 bolls on a plant with equivalent yield. Maybe a couple more thoughts. The time of flower is very critical to cotton. So in a typical Acala plant, between the time we actually have first flower and the time that we actually have last flower, last harvestable flower, that's about a 30-day period. Okay, critical period for pest management, water management. This is extended when we think in terms of the Pima crop. We actually have a 45-day, sometimes a 50-day period in which we have an opportunity to set a flower from that first fruiting branch right on up to the top where we have our last fruiting position on the plant. Thank you, and I hope you learned a little bit about cotton plant mapping.